Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 3 of Featherweight Flyers, the review series for Gran Turismo's ultra lightweight track day sports cars. And we have a reasonably good selection of these cars on the game, but as I've mentioned before in the series, this is narrowing it down to the 10 most outstanding models. And one of the great things about these cars is that although they all share a similar formula, they all approach that formula in very different ways. Some go for larger engines and at the same time giving up some of that weight advantage. Some prefer to stick purely to having the low weight and sacrifice some power, and there are some that are in between. In this particular episode we're featuring a slightly more rare model of lightweight sports car, and one that's from Japan. Now, this car is a bit more exotic than some of the other models in the series, and it's very similar in its style to the Lotus Elise. It is the Tommykaira ZZ-S. And this car is very easily overshadowed by its bigger brother, the ZZ2. It only costs 500 credits less than that car, but the ZZ2 is one of the quickest and one of the best all-round cars on Gran Turismo. So it's got a lot to live up to, and to be purely honest, it can't live up to that. It's just not possible. The ZZ2 has every possible advantage, but how does the ZZ-S stand on its own feet against its more appropriate rivals, stuff like the Lotus Elise, the Suzuki GSX-R4, cars which have already been in the series like the Caterham and the Crossbow? Well, it stacks up against them very well, actually. It's powered, first of all, by a mid-mounted, turbocharged 2-litre engine. It only weighs 612 kilos, which is pretty low. It puts out 370 horsepower, which is pretty good. That's more than something like a Caterham or some of the other models like that, but not necessarily the highest of the class. And it also puts out 239 foot-pounds of torque, which is pretty decent. Not amazing, but decent enough, especially for a car that only weighs 612 kilos. As far as PP, it sits at a perhaps surprisingly low 588, which means that it is a lot lower than the Caterham or the Crossbow, which we've already featured. It's also a lot lower than the light car company Rocket. So why is the PP so low? Well, to be honest, I'm not quite sure, because the ZZ-S is actually a hugely competitive model. Now, it may not be on the same level as the Rocket, but it's certainly a brilliant lightweight sports car in its own right. And interestingly enough, although it's not as quick as the Rocket, it is one of the quickest cars in this series. Because cars such as the Lotus Elises, the Vauxhall VX220, the ASL Goraya, they don't have particularly good top speeds. The Caterham as well doesn't have a very good top speed. They tend to be around 180 to 200. The ZZ-S can do 225 miles per hour without NOS or draft. For a car with only 370 horsepower, and although lightweight is still heavier than many of the other cars that we'll feature in this series, that's pretty impressive performance. Meaning that both of the Tommykaira models that are on the game have very good performance. So the fact that this car is not much cheaper than a ZZ2 does put it at an immediate disadvantage, but there is no doubt whatsoever that this car, for a 60 grand vehicle, is certainly good value. You compare that price to something like the Caterham or the KTM Crossbow, etc., and it is cheaper than many of them. It's cheaper than both of the Crossbows, it's cheaper than the Rocket, it's cheaper than the Lotus Motorsport Elise, it's much cheaper than the Suzuki GSX-R4. It's actually fantastic value for money. The acceleration is also more than good enough to take on the majority of the cars in this series around most tracks. But the real question is, and this is the question of utmost importance to any car in this series, is how does it handle? because at the end of the day these are track cars and they need to be able to corner at least as well as they go in a straight line. Otherwise, what's the point? Well, I'm happy to say the ZZ-S isn't just passable, it's actually excellent around corners. Now, the handling does require a little bit more fettling than some of the others. There are some cars which are naturally very good handling, stuff like the Suzuki GSX-R4 or the Vauxhall VX220. They're pretty much good straight off the bat, you don't really have to do that much to them. Other cars are a little bit more twitchy, like the Caterham or the Elise. The ZZ2, I would say, sits somewhere in between there. It's certainly not the most difficult of cars to drive, but at the same time it doesn't necessarily have great handling straight out of the factory. With some careful diff setup and suspension setup though, it handles beautifully. And although its cornering speeds may not be on the same level as, say, the Caterham or the Rocket, it's certainly competitive enough to beat cars like the Elise, the VX220, etc. on a surprisingly wide variety of tracks. I would say that the Tommykaira ZZ-S is one of the best cars of the series, is fantastic value for money, almost unmatched in fact, considering that it's the same price as the Caterham, but has a massive top speed advantage over many of the others, and at least as good track potential overall. The fact that it's also more obscure and slightly more exotic in nature just adds to the value. So if you are looking for an ultra lightweight track day sports car, the ZZ-S is a fantastic model to go for. But that's it for this episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.